Welcome. I'm your host Conrad Chua on the Balance Sheet, where you can rise above the noise and learn about the most important business issues of our age. Before we get started, if you're new to the show, you can put questions in the comments field, whether you're watching us on LinkedIn, YouTube. You can start by writing down where in the world you're watching this from today. Now, in a previous episode, we looked at how founders such as Elizabeth Holmes, of Theranos and SPF of FTX got all that funding from VCs only to be exposed as frauds. I'll put the link to that episode in the show notes if you want to watch that later. But it does raise the question of whether funding in our free market world is actually effective or efficient. Just as many VCs funded the wrong people, did VCs also reject the right people? In particular, we see that minorities get a much lower proportion of VC funding. To talk about this and other challenges that minority-owned businesses face, we have three research fellows of the Cambridge Center for Social Innovation. First, Professor Simone Phipps. She's Professor of Management at the School of Business at Middle Georgia State University. So, welcome, Simone.
Thank you. Hello, everyone.
And Simone co-wrote a book, African American Management History, Insights on Gaining a Cooperative Advantage, with our next guest, Professor Leon Prieto, who is professor at Clayton State University. Welcome, Leon.
Thanks for having me.
And lastly, we have Yvonne Lardner, who is an alum of the Masters in Social Innovation program here at Judge Business School. And she's now a graduate research fellow at the Center for Social Innovation. Hi, Yvonne.
Hi, Conrad. Thank you so much. Lovely to be here.
Okay. So why don't we start by talking about what are some of the difficulties that minority-owned businesses face in terms of getting funding? Simone, do you want to start us off?
Definitely a serious challenge when minority-owned businesses want to access funding, whether it's to start a business or just to keep it afloat or to grow the business. Sometimes there is a bias, which prevents them from getting access to funding via traditional banks or via venture capital investment funding. And sometimes it's that they are seen as not having sufficient collateral compared to non-minority owners, or credit worthiness is seen as not as good or as poorer compared to non-minority owners. So those are some of the problems when they are looking for access.
Mm. And in terms of things like the quality of collateral, etc., is this something that is seen when they go for debt funding, like approaching banks, or is that also the same when they go and approach venture capitalists for funding?
Well, I can say that. Well, when you look at the VC investment, it's really interesting. So there was research that was done by a company called Extend, which looked at VC investment based on ethnicity of founding team members. And the one thing that I liked about this research is that it actually considers seed, early stage, and later stage funding. And it found that 90% of the total amount of VC raised went to white entrepreneurs, while only 0.24% went to Black entrepreneurs. And I think the interesting thing about that data was that when you look at seed, it was 1.9% for Black entrepreneurs and 87.3% for white counterparts. Early stage was 0.7 compared to 89.8, and later stage was 0.5 compared to 91.8. So not only are they getting a lower investment, they're also, as the rounds are progressing, Black entrepreneurs are also expressing they're experiencing less and less access to VC funding as well. So those are some really interesting numbers that I was able to look at with regards to how it works in the UK.
And the trend is pretty similar in the US as well. So, for example, in the US, when it comes to VC funding, only 1% of VC investment funding goes to Black founders. on everybody else. So that is a significant disparity. And they get, because there's less access to funding, the startup costs of Black founders are usually less. They have less money. And so in the US, usually it's about 35,000 they may have on average to start a business, whereas white founders have about $107,000 to start a business. So they start off with more capital that they can use to build a proper business, make sure you have the right infrastructure, everything. So they have a head start when it comes to that access.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same in the UK. So with median turnover, profit making, meeting non-financial aims, and it's not to say that other things don't come into play. So education, deprivation, underrepresentation, systemic barriers. These are all contributors as well. But the highest contributor for entrepreneurs is access to finance. And unfortunately, it means here in the UK that 90% of Black entrepreneurs, they just stop working on their business idea. And it's not just about Black entrepreneurs. This is also with regards to just, minority ethnic entrepreneurs. So, for Asians, it's actually higher. It's actually 49%. And there are other nuances. So in the UK, geography comes into play. In the Southeast and the Northeast, you will tend to do better than you will do in Greater London. So I think things are mirrored here as well in the UK as they are in the US as well.
Yeah, but things are hopeful. Even though a lot of minority entrepreneurs face a lot of problems accessing capital, there's still VCs who are fighting the good fight. For example, here in the United States, there's Harlem Capital, and they are striving to fund a lot of minority entrepreneurs. There's Aperture, and so there are a number of others, but we need more of those venture capitalists serving minority groups within the United States and also the UK as well.
Yeah, I mean, in the UK, I know of Impact X. So they're a Black-owned venture capital firm, and they've raised 100 million pounds, and that will support underrepresented entrepreneurs within entertainment, media, tech, health, and digital industries. But you're absolutely right. When we think about, how we move forward, we actually do need more Black investors at larger funds and Black investors in senior positions, because they're the ones that actually get to write the checks. And, their barriers have to be reduced with regards to their ability to achieve their target fund size as well. And to be able to ring fence these funds specifically to go to underrepresented and minority ethnic groups.
Definitely. We do need more representation, because when we have people that are minorities in these venture capital companies, they understand better the challenges that are faced, and they can speak up and advocate for worthy Black businesses and other minority owned businesses, which is very important. If I remember correctly, in the US, only about 4% of the VC workforce are minorities. So that is a very small percentage that we have in terms of representation. So if we can increase that representation, it would be very helpful.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I remember there was a couple of years ago, there was an email that went out, and all the Black employees in VC funds in London, they all had a meetup, and they basically could fit into one corner of a small cafe in London, right?
Yes.
And they just counted each other, and they figured there's like 1% of all the people who work in VC are Black. That was a couple of years ago, so I don't know the more current stats. We can talk a bit about why you think some of these barriers or biases exist. But I wanted to just have a shout out to some of our viewers. So we've got Sultan from Saudi Arabia. Someone's watching this from Qatar. Daniel's from Sao Paulo. Someone's watching from Rome. Vidalis is, I guess, in your neck of the woods,
Yes.
Simone and Leon, in Atlanta.
Hi, Vidalis.
We know Vidalis.
Oh, you know her, okay. Salter's watching from DC, and Mohammed's in London. So thank you all for joining. And remember, if you've got any questions, comments, please put them in the chats. And I think at this point it's good to maybe look at Giannis. His comment is that bias is always an issue, especially when it comes to funding. We try to prevent this from happening, but it isn't easy. Do any of you want to start by looking at, trying to figure out why these biases arise?
Well, you have stereotypes sometimes. The stereotype that this business is not going to be legitimate or credible because it's a minority-owned business, and so those stereotypes end up coming into play, and they're just not given a fair chance. For example, let's take with traditional banks, when it came to Black business owners that requested loans, 47% were approved, but 75% of white owners were approved. So why would that be? The only thing is it that all of these white business founders, they have the better credit, the better idea, etc. It's not like that. They're just seen as or perceived as being more legitimate, more credible. So that is one problem, and it's not always intentional bias. Sometimes it is a subconscious bias that is just there in the lenders' minds when they see these applicants come in.
It's an interesting one. Just to add to that, Simone, it's in the UK. It's even before they get to the bank. It's a question of if you even bother to go to the bank to ask for a loan. So here, only 13% of Black-owned businesses look to banks for financial support, and they're more likely to take loans from their family or than they would from a financial service provider. So it's really interesting what happens before you even get to the bank as well.
Right. That's correct over here too. A lot of Black-owned business owners, they go to family friends first before they go to the bank.
Yeah, and there's also bias when it comes to the universities we attend. So some VCs, they will go to the Stanfords and the Harvard Business Schools, but they will not pay attention to the Claflin University or the Morehouse College or Hispanic serving institutions like University of Texas, San Antonio. So they really, shooting themselves in the foot by not exploring opportunities, with some of these potential entrepreneurs at some of these minority serving institutions due to institutional biases,
Definitely.
So the talent pool is not just at the Ivy League schools.
Definitely.
I guess the flip side is also, this institutional bias means that they look at someone from Stanford. There's a much lower barrier in terms of approving funding, for example. And I just think about Elizabeth Holmes, who went to Stanford, got George Schultz, who's a research fellow at Stanford, to be on the board of Theranos. And somehow all these VCs were just falling over themselves to give her funding without, even though the test results were fake or just not credible. So do you think that there's ways to try to break this, for want of a better word, old boys network when it comes to people who are giving the funds?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. Proximity does seem to play a big factor. So where you come from or where you're based can sort of dictate your personal network. So access and proximity to that access will put you at a disadvantage. And I think the other thing to bear in mind is also pattern matching. So, ultimately, VCs are looking for what adds value and what adds value at scale. And Black founders often come from different circumstances than the average founder or the VC that they might be pitching to. So their views and their frame of reference and the problems that they're bringing and the solutions that they have in mind, they sometimes don't match that typical framework that a VC is thinking of, or based on the decks that a VC sees all the time. So you may have situations where the VC actually believes in the Black founder or believes in the Black founding team, but doesn't quite understand the unique marketing opportunity or the unique market opportunity that is being presented to them. So unfortunately for those founders, it means that you kind of, you have to start up your business and try and get to like a minimum viable product and your product vision with such little funding. It's challenging for you right from the offset.
So how you break that cycle of that that good old boys club, as we call it here? A lot of times you need to focus on raising awareness that there really is a problem in the first place. And you need to have those people who are not just allies. We talk about allyship, but we need authentic allies who are going to say, these groups of people, minorities, are at a disadvantage, and it's due to no fault of their own. And there needs to be education and training as when it comes to bias and how do we get around this bias. So telling them, okay, you don't only look at the schools that these entrepreneurs are coming from. You give everybody a fair chance based on the idea and what they are bringing to the table. So education is a very important aspect so that people are aware of their biases. And when they are making these decisions about who to give money to, they can say, okay, I'm being biased here. I need to give this person a fair shot. I think that's part of it. And so you need those authentic allies in the traditional banks and in the VC companies to be able to promote that kind of equity.
Definitely. And no, mentorship is good, but we also need sponsors, in the sense of some of these VCs or potential funders to actually open doors and be intentional about it. So, there are a number of minority entrepreneurs with mentors, but we need to go a step further and really open these doors via sponsorship.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's important to make that distinction, Leon. You're absolutely right, because ultimately people try and interchange this whole mentor sponsor thing without making that distinction. But it's really important to make it because, a mentor is someone who can give you advice, you can strategize your career moves. Whereas a sponsor is a person who advocates for you, and they will advocate for you when you yourself are not in the room. And it's important to make that distinction because, Black founders, particularly Black female founders, they tend to be over mentored and under sponsored. Right. So, we have to be able to understand what the difference is between the two in order to move forward with this idea of sponsorship.
And just to tie all those things together, the importance of role models, mentors, sponsors, business networks, because all of those are linked. When you have mentors, role models, sponsors, then that gives you access, increased access to business networks, which are important for businesses to be able to be started, to survive, and to grow. And so just a little bit of information here. In the US, only 1.4% of retail businesses were Black owned, and the owners themselves cited a lack of social capital and networks that will allow them to invest in important resources like technology, research and development, innovation, all of which are necessary for the business to be successful. So having those sponsors as well as the mentors gives you the access to the business networks that you're going to need, or increases your access to those business networks.
Yeah. And support, and emotional support as well, psychosocial support. It's
Sure.
And, you talk about the role of mentors and role models. So I think this is a good time to bring up Simone and Leon, your book on African American management history. Can you tell us a bit about why you wrote this book? Because I found that really, the reasons for writing was really interesting.
Well, one of the reasons we wrote this book is when we reflected on our time attending a historically Black college, there was hardly any representation in the management textbooks. We didn't learn anything about people of color managing large enterprises, and we didn't learn about their philosophies and their theories of entrepreneurship and management. So we decided early on, you know what? When we get to a certain point in our career, we're going to fill that gap and write a book for students who attended minority serving institutions could see people who look like them, who actually had their own philosophies and theories about how to manage a firm. And we just felt it was time to really introduce a book like this, to those students.
Mhm.
And I found it really interesting, looking through the book that you you brought some you had some examples of very successful African American entrepreneurs, from the 19th century to the early 20th century. What was quite distinctive about their approach to business was this idea of a more cooperative kind of model. Simone, do you want to talk a bit about what is different about that approach?
Yes, we realized when we look at what we call the golden age of what is called the golden age of Black business, which is between the years of 1900 to 1930, that a lot of these Black businesses were able to be successful because of that spirit of cooperation that they had. And so the term that we have is cooperative advantage. And what we define it as is the benefits that an organization can possess and accrue due to its people-oriented approach to business. And it is an approach that engenders care and a spirit of care of community, that engenders dialogue and consensus building. And these three tenets really help the organization to provide benefits for not just the organization, but for stakeholders, whether it be employees, customers, and the community at large. And so there's reciprocal benefit, there's reciprocity, there's mutual benefit for everyone so that the organizations can be successful and they can also make a difference in the community. And we noticed that that spirit of cooperation really helps with success instead of, the unbridled capitalism where you're just trying to make money and not caring about other people. So it was very evident that that spirit of cooperation was among the business leaders and the businesses that we looked at and provided examples of in the book.
I'll come back to why that spirit maybe just died after the 1930s. But I wanted to ask Yvonne, do you see the same kind of distinctive brand of or approach to business and capitalism from minorities here in the UK?
I think we're starting to, because I think, as I mentioned earlier, we're starting to see people trying to pay more attention with regards to how we can actually ring fence things for Black businesses and how we can understand how to better support Black businesses. So you have a lot of you have some of the banks that are trying to ring fence their money specifically for this. You have Black VCs now that are trying to do this, and there's more research that's taking place as well. There's someone here in Cambridge Judge that's actually researching legitimacy, who gets to be the Black entrepreneur. So Odubajo, he's doing his master's in social innovation here, and he's researching how Black entrepreneurs gain legitimacy to achieve investor support. So I think things are starting to move, and rightly so as well, because, one can't overstate the contribution that Black business owners actually make here in the UK, not just to the economy, but actually to society. So, according to a report by the Federation of Small Business Black-led Businesses, Black-led businesses contribute as much as 25 billion to the UK economy. This is no small amount. So I think more and more people are trying to understand and pay attention to how they can help Black-led businesses create value.
And for those who are interested to read up on the book itself, the QR code on the upper right-hand corner, if you scan it, it goes to Amazon, to the Amazon link for the book. But Leon, I wanted to turn to you. So Simone said there was this golden age of Black capitalism, and with the strong emphasis on the being cooperative. Why did that end in the 1930s?
Well, during that time period, close to 1930, the United States experienced the Great Depression. And some of the businesses within the golden age of Black business were also cooperatives. They utilize a cooperative business model. Even if they weren't officially cooperative, they operated as such. And many of those businesses faced prejudice, from some white supremacists who accused them of being, communist or un-American by practicing so much cooperatism, So in the quest to become good capitalists, many African Americans walked away from this spirit of cooperation and embraced unbridled capitalism because they wanted to be seen as American.
And once they did that, they came up against the barriers that we talked about, this sort of institutional barriers and biases. Is that right?
Exactly. So we're advocating for minority entrepreneurs to adopt that spirit of cooperation. And because look where unbridled capitalism has gotten us. We're living in a world faced with racial disparities, biodiversity crisis, climate crisis. In fact, there's a polycrisis. That's the term being used a lot these days. And that's where unbridled capitalism has gotten us. So by utilizing an approach focused or deep-rooted in cooperation, we could envision a different type of economy, a more regenerative one that stands with solidarity and social justice being part of the ideals that we really need, and capitalism, yes, has some reforming to do. And once we incorporate some of these values I just talked about, like cooperation and solidarity, social justice, I think we will be in a much better place.
And I also think, in addition to the Black-owned businesses adopting the spirit of cooperation, I think all businesses need to adapt that idea of cooperation and adopt these tenets of spirit of care and community and dialogue and consensus building. Because if you think about it, if the traditional banks, as well as the venture capitalist companies, as well as educational institutions, as well as governmental agencies and the policymakers adopt that kind of mentality where they care about everyone, not just themselves, then there will be more programs and more initiatives to help those who may be struggling in different areas due to bias and discrimination.
I mean, a lot of this rentier capitalism, right, that we've seen in the last 5-10 years from Silicon Valley, it's very much about let's see how much money can be extracted from the economy, right? And whether it's something like Uber, right, which basically you're trying to get as much money out of people who used to drive or delivery and stuff like that. And there was such a big, lots of money poured in because there was this idea that these things can scale so quickly. What you've been talking about was quite different in terms of that cooperative model, in terms of looking at social justice. What kind of businesses areas do you think those would be in? They're not going to be. They're going to be quite different from those. We're going to get 1 billion users, right? So, what kind of businesses would be this more socially just and fair type of model?
Well, we got BCorps and BCorps. I like that business model, especially those companies that are authentic with their mission. But recently I read a scathing article that criticized some companies that I guess they were implying that they were pretending to be socially driven when in fact they were more extractive in nature and not truly B Corps, But B Corps that really strive to be really socially driven has a potential to really make a difference.
But we can't take away the responsibility of regular corporations as well to try and have some kind of social purpose, and even to be fair in terms of their business dealings, and y- I don't really want to pick on a particular industry, but let's say, for example, the chocolate industry, people make so much money making chocolate, millions of dollars, and they have the executives get such high salaries, but the poor farmers who are picking cocoa can barely a living wage or not make a living wage at all. And so, corporations have a responsibility to adopt that spirit of care and to think about others, other countries, the global the global community, and not just their pockets.
Absolutely.
Go ahead, Yvonne.
No, I totally agree. And I think it's something that has to be written into your governance. I've worked with companies that have it written into their bylaws. So as you said, Leon, yeah, BCorps are absolutely amazing. But triple bottom line, it's the people, it's the planet, it's the prosperity. This is something that people have to now become the fabric embedded into your actual organization. And I think the only way that you can really do it effectively is to have it as part of your corporate governance.
Yeah, and I agree with that point with the corporate governance. And we need a lot of corporations to really think deeply about having minorities on the corporate board, especially those who are passionate and socially driven, who is going to challenge the other board members to do the right thing. And it could also help with diversifying their global supply chain as well, and provide opportunities for minority entrepreneurs.
Absolutely.
So that's needed.
Yeah, so it's really interesting, Leon, you mentioned this thing about supply chains, because Osman's question is, if we need a new economic model, right, would a circular economy type of model help minority-owned businesses?
I think so. And well, here in the US, you've seen a greater push and a greater emphasis on environmental justice, social justice, and a number of minority entrepreneurs have a deep passion for sustainability. And there's and and companies are really thinking about their supply chains and how to have a more circular economy, and in some cases a more regenerative economy as well. So by having minority entrepreneurs who are passionate about that, they can definitely play a major role with a circular economy or a regenerative economy if they are part of that supply chain. Because a number of communities where minorities reside, they face a lot of environmental harm, a lot of environmental injustices. So there's that inherent passion for starting more sustainable businesses, especially those that focus on a circular economy.
Yeah, and I think there's a recent FT article in the Financial Times about the circular economy, about fashion especially, and how we in the West, we give our clothes, used clothes, old clothes to a recycling center, and we think we're doing a good deed, but actually a lot of it just goes to places like Ghana, the Philippines, where the people there have to deal with all that waste. Obviously, they try to resell some things, but a lot of times they don't, they can't, and they have to live with the waste that comes out from the West. And I think this idea of getting more minority voices into a business will really help close that circle and let businesses think, actually, how are we just throwing things out, sweeping things under the carpet almost, isn't it?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Sorry, Leon, go ahead.
I was going to say, businesses have a responsibility, but we also need strong public policy as well. So politicians have to do their part as well, to really aid in really creating the circular economy that is needed. So I'm not a big fan of too many sticks, so we need some carrots, but at least, wave a big stick once in a while for companies to do the right thing, but more carrots are needed.
Yeah. So I think we could spend the last 10 minutes thinking about if you are a CEO of a company, you want to bring in more minority voices, more minority people into your company, into senior management and leadership. What do you think? What would your advice be to people in the C-suite who want to do this?
An important step would be to build and nurture relationships with universities, with historically Black colleges and universities, and also to have programs with predominantly white institutions, because there are minority students at predominantly white institutions, and those institutions need to have programs where they connect these Black budding entrepreneurs or those who intend to be entrepreneurs with business leaders in companies, so that you can have that connection and provide these students with access to the opportunities, whether it's be via internships or career opportunities upon graduation. So building a pipeline from university to business, the business world upon graduation is a good step.
Yeah, and that pipeline is needed also, not just at universities as well, but vocational centers, and also corporations could play a role as well by offering, discounted certification programs in areas such as machine learning, artificial intelligence, and another areas as well where there's a high demand. So provide different pathways for different minority groups who want to one day utilize what they've learned into creating their own enterprise.
I also think you have to think about what their experience is going to be in your organization. So I think a lot of organizations will talk about diversity, as your question alluded to, Conrad. But ultimately, what happens when you actually get into that organization? So, a lot of minorities, they struggle when they're on the entrepreneurial path or when they're in the organizational structure, because that idea of inclusion and belonging suddenly starts to float away. So I think a lot of organizations, CEOs, VCs, they also have to really think about what that assimilation journey is like for people who are coming from, minoritized backgrounds as well.
Yeah.
And I think that's also really important, especially, Leon, you were talking about these new growing areas such as AI and machine learning, because for a lot of minorities, it's important for them to see that there is a pathway for them in these sort of areas, because these are the areas that will be growing. And these are the areas that will get a lot of funding if they choose to start a business, for example. So I think that part is really quite important. Just wanted to ask, have you seen companies that are doing this well?
Well, I'll have to give a shout out to. Go ahead, Yvonne. You go ahead.
No, I was going to say, Leon, you mentioned earlier BCorps. BCorps, they're held to a standard. So, there are definitely companies out there that are doing it well. Companies out there that can measure their impact. I'm consulting for a company at the moment, Natura & Co. ESG is built into their bylaws, and they think about it when they think about profit and loss from an integrated perspective. So it's about people, purpose, planet. So I definitely think that there are companies out there that are doing it well. It's not all bad. And I definitely think there's an opportunity for the companies who are doing it well to try and show other people what it is that they're doing. So it is about that cooperative, it's about that coalition, it's about that collaboration. So they can also teach other companies, because smaller companies, they may not have the resources to do this as well as bigger companies can. That is another issue. So it's one thing wanting to do it, but it's another thing with regards to, can you do it? Do you have the resources? Do you have the knowledge? So yes, there are people doing it well, but they also need to make sure that they are sharing how they are doing it with others.
There's a company that I'm very fond of in the US as well, and it's in the chocolate industry. It's Askinosie Chocolate. And the founder actually has a business model where he has a personal relationship with the farmers in different countries like Tanzania, Ecuador, in the Philippines.
Yeah.
And so he travels to them and they have a conversation. He shows them the books, and there's a fair wage that they get based on sharing profits, and he shows them how their cocoa actually contributed to his bottom line and make sure they understand and things like that. And so if we have more companies that think about the supply chain and who they are dealing with, who the suppliers are, what their circumstances are, and how they can be more fair and equitable to them. Because it's because of the suppliers that they're able to make, good money. So if you have more companies that think about things like that, we'd be in a better
Okay.
place.
And I'll
What
give
was
a
the
shout
company
out.
called? Sorry, what was the company called again? Asking OC.
Askinosi Chocolate. Yes.
Okay.
The founder's name is Sean Askinosi.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Leon.
Yeah. Yeah, and the company I wanted to shout out was Vista Equity Partners. And the founder of that company is Robert F. Smith, and he's the wealthiest African American. He's a billionaire, and he's very intentional with um, helping minority serving institutions. So he's invested, a lot of his resources in, teaching minorities how to invest and providing a lot of scholarships. He even spent 34 million out of his own money to pay for the tuition of graduating seniors at Morehouse College, which is the only Black male university in the United States. So he's putting his money where his mouth is, So pretty much, if you have more minority entrepreneurs, they're going to come back and really make a difference in the community, because all of them went through the struggles themselves. So they have a vested interest in really making that difference where it matters.
Yeah. I think for me, it would be, as I mentioned them earlier, Impact X Capital Partners. They're a Black-owned venture capital firm, and they've already raised $131 million to support underrepresented entrepreneurs. And so I think they're doing great things in the UK.
And I thought we could end off with this comment from Saswati, who says, as a new entrepreneur, she's trying to put together a good governance system to focus on providing internships to minority and less represented groups. So Saswati, thank you for that comment. If you could put in a bit more information about actually what are you doing in terms of that, what's your idea, what are you putting in place in terms of governance, that'd be great. But Simone, Leon, or Yvonne, what do you have any suggestions for Saswati and others who are trying to provide internships to minority groups?
I would say to connect with the universities and because you can get access here. That is some easy access, but also to organizations in the community that serve minority individuals and students, like after school programs, etc. And just a simple thing that we don't think about sometimes when we think of entrepreneurial knowledge and skills, something basic as simple financial understanding, like financial literacy, because it has been shown that entrepreneurs do better when they have that. And usually Blacks are behind whites when it comes to financial literacy. I saw a survey where 38% of Blacks got answers right on a particular financial literacy test, whereas 55% of whites got it right. So even having a program like that where there's financial literacy, which then builds into that credit worthiness, that helps as well as entrepreneurs want to gain there. So that helps with internships as well, if you build that into programs.
And also try to get input from the people you're trying to serve, the students themselves, and ensure that they're not just fixing coffee for their managers, because I've had internships in the past where I had to speak up to pretty much demand the opportunity to actually learn something meaningful. I was told by my mentors being too forward with that, but I was focused on my development. So let's ensure that they're also stakeholders in developing this program.
Okay.
Very true.
Yes, and I think Saswati says she's partnering with some universities and designing financial wellness interventions. So that's really great stuff.
Good.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Simone, Yvonne, and Leon, for sharing your experiences, your thoughts about how minority-owned businesses can get ahead. It's been wonderful, and I hope that everybody who's watching, you can share this recording after that with other people who could who are in a position to do something that can help minority-owned businesses. It's not just helping minorities because it's a good thing. It is a good thing, of course, but it's also makes business sense. So I hope people can take that away. And thank you once again to all three of our speakers. Now,
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you.
yeah. So the live stream, the balance sheet is, we're going to take a break for Easter, but we've got a huge lineup when we return. We're going to look at MBA career outcomes, issues like the circular economy, which we talked a bit about today, global geopolitics, lots more. And we'll be back on the 21st of April at our usual time of 12:45 p.m. UK time, where we'll be looking at the big kahuna of 2023. How are we going to work with AI? So stay well and see you next time.